Hubs. Concluded. On the Monday of the very last week of the kids' summer vacation, 2019, Hubs and I were on our way to Hamilton to finally see the specialist about his pancreatic cyst. It was early morning, and Hubs was driving. I've always been very nervous about inner city driving in a city I'm not familiar with, and especially a big city. Hubs rarely seems to get nervous about anything, so even though he was very decrepit indeed, he was driving. We were worn out, and I don't know if I can speak for Hubs, but I was relieved that we were finally getting somewhere, or so it seemed, and that we had that golden ticket appointment with a specialist. Our trip to the beach had been very stressful. Hubs couldn't really eat much of anything. He felt awful all the time, and he was unable to rest at night due to constant burping and hiccuping. I knew a specialist appointment was in the works, but we still hadn't heard anything. I was so worried that a message would be left on our home answering machine and we'd miss it. I checked repeatedly, but there were no messages. I felt like things had become completely intolerable at this point. We'd been stoic all along. We understood that the pancreas is a crucial organ, and operating on it was only done when absolutely necessary. But Hubs had lost almost 100 pounds by this point, and his stomach was as distended as a woman late in her second trimester of pregnancy. It was beyond time to have something happen. It's not the easiest thing to navigate well through the Canadian health system. Yes, we're very lucky to not have to pay for doctor visits and hospital stays, and if you have something minor or commonly treatable, it's a good system. As soon as you deviate into more serious health territory, though, you're kind of fucked. Getting care for Dad when he needed round-the-clock care was a nightmare, and I tried to combine the paltry amount of care we were eligible for with family availability. Awful. On our beach trip, as I had done before we left, I was trying to phone around to every doctor I could get a hold of, and guess what? They were all on vacation at the same time. I couldn't believe it. I was in total despair. There was nothing I could do but wait on it and get back to the phone wars when we got back home. Luckily, the receptionists of the specialists were very, very kind and helpful. Confusion was cleared up, and we were given a clear path forward with Dr. Jindagi, and then we were given an appointment. I figured we would be sitting down and having a chat about how best to proceed. We imagined and planned for a few different outcomes. Would the cyst be drained, or would there be major surgery? We tried to mentally prepare ourselves for both. We were told to go to a well-known hospital up on Hamilton Mountain. I wondered quietly to myself if that would be the hospital I'd been in to sit with someone going for chemo many years before. The drive up the mountain had seemed crazy to me then, even as a passenger, and after that zigzag up the mountain, there was this crazy road sign at the top, which had a drawing of a convoluted squiggle of converging roads drivers needed to prepare for. That sign freaked me out. I mentally named it the Pretzel. Anyway, I Googled the hospital for address and directions. Not only was it near the hospital I'd been to with my friend, it was that hospital. It has a different name now, but yeah, same hospital. I couldn't believe it. Eventually this will all make sense, but in a nutshell, I was right on the brink of heading back to a traumatic location I had reassured myself I would never have to return to again. And I was about to go there in the very near future. How do you like them apples? Luckily, Hubs and I arrived in good time because there was some confusion between whether the office was in the medical building beside the hospital or the hospital itself. Eventually, we found where we were going. Dr. Jindagi was a very nice, slim, smart, soft-spoken man who I figured was around my age despite his abundance of gray hair. He was very sympathetic to what Hubs had been going through and genuinely enthusiastic to help. First, he invited us to a room nearby with a better computer so we could get a look at what we were dealing with. It was incredible. A massive cyst had wrapped itself nearly all the way around Hub's stomach. His stomach itself appeared in the image as flat as a pancake. Basically it was, you see that line there? That's your stomach. Holy shit. No wonder whenever he ate more than a toddler-sized meal, it sent his body into total chaos. There was no room for food. No wonder Hub's body was nearly always in digestive upset. Both our jaws dropped when we saw that. Dr. Jindagi was still very positive despite this rather horrifying predicament. He said that he could put in a drain and it would take many weeks to slowly drain that cyst, or he could do an all-in-one operating table extravaganza. He would cut on into Hubs, make an incision in the cyst and the stomach, and while in there, use that convenient opening in Hubs to yank out that evil stone-filled gallbladder. The hope was that the cyst would simply drain off whatever fluid wasn't drained during surgery into the stomach. This could cause some digestive issues and some pain, but he felt it was the best way to go. Dr. Jindagi looked at us seriously and with great compassion. In a calm voice, he said, "I think you've been through enough suffering. It's time we fix this." Hubs and I started crying. We agreed. We were done with watch and wait. We needed to get Hubs back to a normal life. The doctor was pleased with our decision. "All right then," he said cheerfully. "What we need to do is get you admitted so you're in the system." The hope was that they could fit Hubs in as soon as possible for surgery. Okay, we agreed to that. "Let's get you settled in today." Wait, what? Did he just say today? He was nonplussed by our surprise. Sure, it made the most sense. Why wait any longer? Oh my God! We hadn't brought anything with us. No books for Hubs, no change of underwear, no personal hygiene items, no toothbrush, nothing. And most of all, I would realize soon enough we hadn't brought one of the most important things with us, his phone charger cord. My stomach dropped even further. Yeah, it probably sounds really silly and selfish, but I would have to drive home alone from the top of the mountain in Hamilton, from whence I had never driven before. I would soon be taking a crash course on finding my way out of an unfamiliar city. Holy shit! Listen, when I go on a trip or somewhere unfamiliar to me, I always A. look up directions, B. study directions, C. print directions, and I often D. write down some quick-glanced, abridged bullet points of which streets come immediately before the street I'm looking for. Maybe add in some noteworthy landmarks. I do all of this and program the destination into the GPS. My joke for many years is that if I had my own Latin motto, it would be, and pardon my Latin, it's only as good as the online translator I selected, and the pronunciation probably even worse. Relinquere nil forte, meaning leave nothing to chance. I know, you probably don't get it. Most normal people don't get freaked out by these things. Oh, to be a normal person. But what else could we do? More than anything in the world, at that point in time, what I wanted was for poor Hubs to just get better, to just be well again. Can you imagine if I'd said to the doctor, this is a little awkward because you can't drive home on my own. You can't. I'm afraid to. Aren't you a grown-up and clearly in your 40s? I don't like driving in cities I'm unfamiliar with, okay? That convo never happened, but ugh. So anyway, we got Hubs all checked in. The hope would be that the doctor would be able to operate on him ASAP, and that could mean the next day. We were both nervous, but this was so good. The time had arrived for me to headless chicken my way out of town. Hubs wasn't particularly sympathetic. He actually had the nerve to have belief in my abilities. I stumbled shakily out of the hospital and down the sidewalk the short distance back to the open-air parking garage just down the street. Thank God I almost always pay attention to where we park. Otherwise, there surely could have been some really embarrassing, panicky, aimless wandering and crying. Ugh. I'd even taken a picture of the floor and parking spot numbers with my phone after we'd parked, and a picture of which door we'd come out of, And why did I do that? Relinquere nil forte. That's right, that is how I roll. I got into the car, rather shaky, reassuring myself aloud. Okay, Karen, old kid, old sock, you can do this. Of course you can do this. Another thing most people would not relate to. As far as technology, and especially cell phones are concerned, I'm cheap. I wanted the cheapest monthly package my cell phone provider has to offer. So in the past, I never had data. I am one of those people who only has Wi-Fi if I know the Wi-Fi password or if it's free Wi-Fi. My monthly phone package included a small amount of data that I could use, but I almost never turned my data on and utilized this feature. I had no choice. I had to turn my data on and hope that it would work. We hadn't brought the GPS with us. Hubs had used his phone to get us there. I entered in my home address and waited for the internets to locate where I was and start crafting me up a route. I was ready to go. This was a self-serve parking garage, and that time and every time thereafter that I would use that parking garage, I would hold my breath, fearing that for some reason my credit card would glitch in the little machine at the exit, not raise the gate arm, and I'd be stuck there with a line of cars behind me and no way to figure out how to get the hell out of there without human support. The arm lifted, and so I turned left and headed off down that long, straight road with a spectacular view of the city of Hamilton below, stretching out to Lake Ontario, the Burlington Skyway in miniature off in the distance, with tiny cars moving across it in both directions. That was the easy bit. Then I had to briefly navigate the pretzel, which really turned out to not be that bad. A bit of a roundabout interchange on speed, but I made it through. Zigzagged down the mountain as per Google Maps instructions. It all seemed okay, but as I did a million quick peripheral darts of the eyes from the road ahead to my phone on the empty passenger seat and back to the road, I could see that a turn was coming up before long, but Google had stopped yapping. In fact, it was dead quiet, and that highlighted route was getting near the turn. The sweat was starting to roll. Why isn't this thing telling me that my turn's coming up? And then, according to the little map beside me, it looked like my turn was here and still never said anything. But I went on faith and made a couple of quick hoop-de-doos and skipped through 2 tiny roads and turned right and just hoped I had made it through correctly. Somehow, miraculously, I'd done something right because the map started talking again. Too little too late, map. Thanks for nothing, you asshole. I'd made it off the mountain. It was a brief break of long straight road, and then a right turn on the last road to get me back to the parkway, which would then take me to that familiar highway. By the time I had to merge onto the parkway, my nerves were so shot that I literally could barely turn my head over my tree trunk stiff neck to do one of those necessary shoulder checks that keep you from getting, killed by oncoming traffic. As I shaky-armed it onto the busy parkway, I thought to myself, well, I hope there's nobody coming up right behind me because I can't even turn my head. Seriously. Finally, my exit came up for the highway. The good old, boring old, familiar old QEW, the Queen Elizabeth Way. As uncomfortable as I am with inner-city driving, I'm generally quite comfortable, relaxed even, on the highway. So I was relieved and more at ease, even while being essentially shot from the whole boom, surprise kind of day I was still wrapping my brain around. Anyway, I'm harping on this a lot, but it was traumatic enough for me that I'm still working on reframing it for good. Telling myself whenever I get the chance to remember to be proud of myself. I did that drive. Me. I found my way through, and then did it a few more times. I even got to a point where I liked driving up that mountain. Me, Karen, that scaredy cat who swore I'd never drive to Hamilton by myself. The hope was that Hubs would get a spot for surgery the very next day. Hell, maybe even the middle of the night, as soon as a surgeon was free and available. This was communicated through Hubs via text on his rapidly dying cell phone. The one we had not brought a charger for. because we never expected a doctor to ever say, "Hey man, I say we go for it, like right now." So, because surgery could supposedly happen at any time, Hubs wasn't allowed to eat anything. This wasn't good because when he didn't eat anything for longer than a few hours, his stomach and bile production went berserk. The hiccups started up in earnest, and he could eventually start vomiting that overflow of bile just from the nauseating bodily jarring of the hiccups. I couldn't help it. I was also a bit troubled by the idea of a surgeon performing a surgery that important at some ungodly hour of the dark morning. Like, should anybody be doing anything really, really important at 3 a.m. if they can avoid it? I mean, I know it can't be avoided sometimes, but I couldn't help imagining a weary doctor rubbing his eyes after a few surgeries, boom, 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 all in a row right before that, yawning as he washed his hands to get ready to go to work on Hubs. I didn't like it that I wasn't there with him either. I had to be home with the kids, though. We both agreed. The next morning, I soon learned he did not go into surgery overnight. And so that happened all that week until Thursday. Hubs got bumped over and over again, and each day he kept having to stop eating or drinking anything at a certain time to prepare for a surgery that would never happen. It was beyond stressful. By Wednesday, we were so fed up with the slow starvation of the poor human stick figure. I think Hubs spoke up for himself and said enough was enough, and if they weren't going to operate him by Wednesday evening, he wasn't going to be able to tolerate another long day of eating nothing. The nurse hunted out some food for him. Hubs told me I didn't want to know what he'd found for Hubs to eat. I didn't ask at the time, but apparently it was a couple of pieces of bread, peanut butter, and a couple of yogurts. The bread had been warmed up in the microwave, which seems both odd and touching at the same time. Hubs was protecting me from knowing about the peanut butter since I was totally paranoid about any fatty foods activating his gallbladder and potentially firing another stone into the danger tube. On Thursday, we finally received some clarity and some renewed hope from Dr. Jindagi. A slot had magically opened up for surgery for the next morning, Friday. It was a definite, and it was scheduled. Hubs would not be bumped from this time slot, because it was his time slot now. Dr. Jindagi and his receptionist had worked as a dynamic team, making extremely quick phone calls and pulling strings everywhere they could to get that spot for Hubs. From the sounds of it, it was nothing short of a miracle. There are truly amazing people in this world. "Go home tonight," Dr. J told Hubs. "Get some rest, have some lunch and some dinner, but have nothing to eat after that." I was not there that day, but Hubs had told me over the phone, and wonderfully, Hubs' brother was going to come and drive him to our house. I wouldn't have to drive up that day. And so we finished out that Thursday, totally beat. We would have to get up early to get back to that hospital in good time for prep before the morning surgery. I was much more confident about the drive by that point, but I brought a GPS with me anyway, just because I enjoyed the soothing voice of George as he reassuringly guided me to my destination and back. George had been Dad's GPS. That's what Dad had named the mature gentleman voice. George was like a familiar friend when I went with my sister to visit Dad in Florida a few times. I can still hear George pleasantly guiding us along the Tamiami Trail. I even had the route all set and ready to go on Hub's GPS, which I didn't love as much, but I was bringing along anyway because relinquere nil forte. Friday morning showed a beautiful sunny day. We were all ready and we had anything and everything we might need for a stay in the hospital, all packed and ready. I didn't need the GPS by this point, but it was so nice to have an electronic friend. We headed out on the highway, and that's where George shit himself. Suddenly, the GPS thought we were not traveling on the highway, but instead through the expanse of grass on the right. George yapped constantly, trying to give us corrector routes to get off the field and back onto the highway. "We are on the highway, George." What the fuck? It was no use. We turned it off and then on again, and George thought we were starting out from a midway point in Hamilton. Madness. We had to turn George off and give up. Hubs turned on his GPS. It also could not seem to calculate the route, even though it knew it. I swear the fates used to mess with me in the past, and that apparently was the morning that the satellites up in space or wherever lost it, right at that moment when I was taking Hubs for surgery. George never recovered from that and was never the same thereafter. Rest in peace, George. We got to the hospital and checked in for surgery. The staff were all super nice and everything was really organized. We came into a pre-surgery waiting hallway with individual areas partitioned off with your basic hospital curtains. Each area had a comfy vinyl lazy boy style recliner and chairs for visitors. Hubs was given an interesting paper gown. It had a special hole on the front of it that was then hooked up to a tube that actually blew warm air over the wearer. This is good because poor stick figure Hubs was nearly always cold at this point, and that waiting area was absolutely friggin' freezing. He was also given a blanket to keep over his bare legs. He was pretty cozy. I was slowly getting hypothermia. Luckily, because I relinquere nil. It's getting obnoxious now, isn't it? I had packed Hub's hoodie jacket in case he was ever chilly in the hospital. I put that thing on, let me tell you. That sub-zero section was freezing. At some point, the nurse took his blood pressure and his temperature, etc., and I don't remember too much more aside from cracking jokes and making small talk before the time arrived when they were ready to get him prepped for surgery. Oh, the anesthetist popped in to say hello in advance to ask questions about stuff. I was given directions as to where I'd find my own waiting room during surgery, and off Hubs went. In the waiting room, I found my in-laws. The way the waiting room worked was that when a patient had completed surgery, a phone call would be made to that room. Whoever was near the phone was supposed to answer it and call out for the person they were looking for. This is not really my thing, so I tried hard not to let that person be me. It's a lot of fun at times being an extremely introverted person. At some point, to pass the time, we all wandered off to find one of the cafeterias to get something to eat. This is when I realized that all the hallways and junctures on that level, A, looked exactly the same, and B, didn't have the best signage. So, my advice, if you're ever in a large hospital, is to get that phone out and take pictures of important little details like floor-level signs or anything else that will point you back to where you need to go. It's easy to forget this stuff when you're in the thick of the moment and you're running on adrenaline. At some point, a very miniature, very serious woman with a suitcase came into the waiting room, and even though there were many places to choose from to sit, she gravitated to the intimate little alcove section we had made ourselves comfortable in, and plunked herself down on the utilitarian waiting room metal sofa right near me. She stayed there for a while, and then, just as soundlessly as she'd come in, she left. After about 3 hours, Dr. Jindagi found us. He came in looking very happy and casually perched himself on the thin, unforgivingly hard metal arm of the sofa, cool yogi style. I still picture that from time to time. Who else can perch on a hard steel bar so casually and comfortably like that? Anyway, the surgery had been a complete success. The gallbladder had been removed without incident, and most importantly, the cyst had been cut and drained. Dr. J had removed nearly 3 liters of fluid. That is the equivalent of nearly 3 Canadian bags of milk or close to a gallon of liquid. No complications, no problems, just a good, smooth surgery. We were all so happy and teary and relieved. Hubs would be moved to recovery soon, and we would get a call when we'd be able to see him. In recovery, I found a beyond serene, super medicated Hubs, lying peacefully on his gurney amidst the organized chaos, bedding loosely but cozily pulled up over his body and arms to his shoulders, lying slightly elevated with a little plastic kidney-shaped barf bowl resting on his chest. Hub's parents were allowed to come in for a couple of minutes and then got kicked out due to space and visitor allowance. That ward was a hustle and bustle of other patients who were recovering from surgery, loads of machines beeping and booping, and nurses and other staff bustling around. The nurse assigned to Hubs was very friendly and pleasant. and busily entering information into her computer at her little terminal beside his bed. She asked him if he needed to pee. "Yeah," he said, easy breezy, super casual. "I'm okay for now. Maybe soon." Imagine a relaxed, cheerful, almost indifferent, shoulder-shrugging kind of tone. "Okay," the nurse replied as she typed away. "You just let me know." I was standing beside Hubs, giving him little sips of his drink with the help of the bendy straw now and again, and probably doing what I always do in any less than optimum situation, cracking jokes. I told him all about the success of his surgery, and he took it all in with a beatific face of blissful, polite interest. After a while, he casually said, "I might need to pee soon." Nurse: "Okay, I'll get you a urinal in just a moment." Hubs, still serene: "Okay." The moments pass by. I'm looking at Hubs. I'm looking at the nurse. The nurse is super busy and still working on stuff. She's not making any moves to get that urinal. Hubs is still completely serene. My sensory switchboard is lighting up though, and eventually I have to jump in and say, I think Hubs needs to pee now, despite whatever low-key mumbo-jumbo he's been spouting. No problem. Nurse gets me a urinal to help Hubs use and pulls the curtain around for privacy. It's a plastic jug with a conveniently angled spout at the top for men to, a hole to stick the penis into. I can hear my dad in my head, who disapproved of such crude proper terms right now, saying, "Shorty, you know better than that." Oh yeah, sorry Dad. Wiener, to put his wiener in. It's slightly awkward, but thankfully Hubs handles most of it. Then he starts peeing. Then he pees some more. And more. And more. He keeps on peeing. It's getting to a point where he's getting close to peeing so much that the pee will start to sloosh right on out of that jug soon and onto the bed. I have a horrified dilemma-filled moment, and luckily Hubs stops peeing right before it's filled over the danger line. "I might need to pee soon," he says. Understatement of the year. After about 2 hours of standing in a cold room next to Hubs, flipping from foot to foot as they got sore, and sitting while he napped on and off, a room was finally available, and he was finally able to move on from recovery. We were just waiting for someone to come move him. And now I can't remember what that job is called in the hospital, that kind soul who moves patients around all day. I briefly wondered what it would be like to do that job, until I realized I'd be receiving pages all day about who to move where, and I'd have to keep that really well mentally organized. Eventually the dude arrived and off we went. He led us down a hall that was seemingly deserted. It was a quiet hall that was a go-between the newer section of the hospital and the ward Hubs would be staying in. The large windows all along the way offered a spectacular view of the city as it stretched out below and the seemingly vast lake beyond. Hubs got all settled in, and his IV and other hookups connected. His personal belongings had not shown up and wouldn't show up until sometime later that night when I had to phone from home and get a little pushy, and they were eventually found right near the nurse's desk. I could write a whole book on how that kind of unnecessary junk happens all the time in my life, but never mind that. I realized not long after sitting with Hubs in his room that I was completely fried. I left not too long after. I can remember stepping out the front door of the hospital, down the path, and out to the sidewalk, looking down that sidewalk and around at the whole world and being filled with so much emotion. Indescribable emotion, relief, exhaustion, intense gratitude, an unbelievably beautiful, surreal moment that we'd actually made it to the other side. The last Friday of the last weekend of summer vacation, Labor Day weekend. Just 3 days after that, and the kids would be going back to school, and I was supposed to be going back to work. The next day, Saturday, utter burnout. I stayed home. Sometimes you reach a point when a loved one is in the hospital perhaps, or you've been caring for a loved one for an extended period of time, where you are so completely toasted that you have no choice but to take a forced break. It's a weird feeling because on one hand you feel like such a jerk for not being by their side, but you have reached a previously unattained level of exhaustion which renders you useless. That's a fancy way of saying I was so wiped out I took the more selfish option and stayed home with the kids that day. It was kind of a good thing, even as it was a sad thing. Hubs was not feeling too hot after surgery, as was to be expected. Later that evening, he had a pitiful episode of power hurling all over himself. He surmises it was all of the remaining fluid from the cyst that had drained into his stomach. His stitched-up midsection made it impossible to just sit up and turn to the side of the bed, so the best he could do was to turn his head to the side and yark all over his arm. And while doing so, he remembers that all he could think of was, "Oh no, my IV arm!" At some point the next day, his first meal showed up. This one, in its own way, beats out those friggin' meatballs he'd had not too long after his pancreas had gone supernova. You'd think it would be something really simple like, I don't know, broth. But no, I just throw up my hands in futility sometimes when I think of hospital food. Yeah, I appreciate how difficult it must be to feed a lot of people every day, but I feel like it is some of the least intuitive cooking out there. My daughter cracked a funny joke after Hubs was served a plate full of meatballs. She imagined a scenario of a medical staff member speaking with the head hospital chef. "Okay, so we have a patient who is recovering from acute pancreatitis. He's going to need a low-fat diet and we're having meatballs. Oh, that's not good. That could potentially be very hard on his system. He gets what I'm cooking." So that was then. The first meal Hubs had after having his gallbladder yanked out, a giant pancreas cyst drained, and probably still had a stomach that was reinflating itself back up to something closer to stomach shape, was a nice bowl of army green broccoli cheddar soup. Yeah, that came back up twice as ugly as when it went down. Hubs now forever hates broccoli cheddar soup. Maybe that soup was a tool to help clean out his system. The good old kill or cure. Hubs was not a happy Hubs that day, let me tell you. Surgery is brutal on the system. I came back one last time to visit before Hubs got to come home on the Sunday. Before I returned to the car afterwards, I walked behind the parking garage, across a small parking lot, across a quiet road and over to the sidewalk on the other side, and took a picture of myself standing against the rail. "Look, Mom and Dad, I made it." The pic doesn't really do the view justice. Cell phones rarely do. I took a picture as well of the grubby, green, rust-strewn parking garage door. In that moment, that door seemed like something more. It wasn't just a door. It was a door to a new phase in my life. Possibility. I'd come back to a hospital that held a place of great sadness in my mind, and this time I'd driven to it, and the outcome was good. Like rewriting history in a way. Time to walk through that door and begin to leave the past behind. Midweek, Hubs was able to come home from the hospital. Dr. Jindagi is a strong believer that a patient can heal better at home. Imagine that! All that jello and constant noise isn't conducive to healing. My work was very understanding. I supervised the kids for their morning break, and then I hopped into my car with everything ready to go and drove off to Hamilton. That girl, who couldn't even turn her fucking neck, mentally shitting herself as she merged onto the parkway 10 days before, was now a pro. Hell, I even liked winding up and down that mountain at that point. Hubs was all signed out and waiting for me. I don't remember too much immediately after getting back home. I imagine I had more soothing foods on offer, but I guess that period of time was thankfully not particularly noteworthy aside from some digestive upset as Hub's system recalibrated. One night, not too long after, we went to our favorite pho restaurant. Hubs insisted on having one of their amazing deep-fried spring rolls. I was nervous as hell. He wasn't hesitant at all. He'd been fantasizing about junk food obsessively for about 8 months. He thought that spring roll was mind-blowing. And that was that. And I'm not kidding. After all the drama and the unbelievable amount of stress and the profound weight loss and all the horror that just seemed to build and build and build after St. Patrick's Day to just before Labor Day, somehow, miraculously, Hubs was simply able to eat again. We went out for dinner on our anniversary in September, and he could simply eat and enjoy every bite of his meal. Yes, I hovered for a while after surgery, but he pretty much felt fine. Pop made him feel funny, but he didn't really seem to have any trouble with food. He steadily began to put weight back on. It wasn't long before we stopped being able to see every bone in his back. His hair became thick again with a healthy shine, no longer thin and dull and weirdly soft. After the storm, the rainbow had truly come out. I was and am still profoundly grateful. It took a very long time for me to feel better after that. Perhaps I'm still working on it a bit. If I think about it enough, or sometimes if a memory of those awful months is triggered, and I am reminded about how much Hubs really suffered, I still tear up. It's a mere few days before the 2-year anniversary of that surgery. It was during this calm after the storm, just a couple of months after that summer surgery, that I fell into a deep hole of anxiety that I could no longer ignore. I could no longer joke about being a perpetual nervous wreck as I had done without realizing it for many years. It was my breaking point. It was when I reached an ultimate low, a bottom I had to reach in order to begin a slow, bewildering, overwhelming, and at times unbearable, scared but determined climb up out of a very long, dark pit. Healing is a journey of seemingly endless work, but it's beautiful, utterly beautiful along the way, thank God. I keep telling myself and my daughter, who was also deeply affected in her own quiet, internalizing way, that what we have to remind ourselves, until every part of us feels it, is that it all turned out well in the end for Hubs, her father. It takes a ton of time and self-love to slowly quiet that nervous system back down again. I'm still working on it. I'm getting there. Late August 2021.